What's up guys, Super Panda here, and I'm excited to be bringing you my comprehensive guide to mastering the melee interceptor. You're going to be learning some hidden mechanics and efficiency tactics that I've never seen mentioned anywhere before, and there's going to be a lot of tips and information that apply to all javelins, so if you don't play the interceptor, there is going to be some value for you guys too, if you want to stick around for that. I'm going to be going in depth into each of the abilities, weapons, components, and sigils that I recommend the highest for the different melee builds and how they synergize and interact with one another. Throughout the video, I will also be showing you relevant clips to demonstrate something that I'm talking about whenever I feel it's necessary. I would also like to preface the video by saying that it assumes you know a little bit about interceptor gear because I don't want to waste any time explaining what every piece of gear does. And also, this video won't just be for anyone. There are lots of videos out there that'll just tell you to run Venom Bomb and Tempest Strike. This is for anyone who plays the Interceptor or aspires to play the Interceptor that wants to truly understand the class and how the different builds can apply themselves differently in different situations. First, we're going to talk about weapons, since a lot of this information will apply to other javelins as well. But I'm going to be talking about the weapons in the context of a melee build, and there's 4 categories that I want to go over. The first one is shotguns. And the only 2 shotguns I would recommend are Radiant Fortress and Rolling Carnage. Now, Radiant Fortress does have really low damage output, but it does give you sustain if you have a higher shield build, and it allows you to stay in the fight when you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Some of the best examples of this are if you're fighting a Scar Enforcer with no trash around it, or a Titan, and it's especially useful against these enemies because they have fire, which is one of the Interceptor's biggest weaknesses. The Rolling Carnage is a really good shotgun for the Interceptor. It's the Interceptor shotgun, and it's good for any gun or melee build, and it doesn't really need a lot of explaining. You could use the Pop-Up Pump if you have really good rolls on it, but it just isn't going to be as good as a Rolling Carnage on the same level. And in general, shotguns are just going to be good for getting those one-off shots that allow you to do additional burst damage in between repositioning yourself. And the downside, of course, is that you can only use them at close quarters. And the next category of weapon that I want to talk about is machine pistols. And the 2 machine pistols that I would recommend are both Unending Battle and Vast's Surprise. Now, Vast's Surprise normally isn't actually good for the Interceptor because we have Elusive Talisman, but since you aren't going to be bringing Elusive Talisman in a melee build, the perk actually becomes useful. And when it's Unending Battle that we're talking about, obviously you're bringing it for that 5-second buff that increases melee damage. Now, I will say that I don't think that Unending Battle is worth it to bring unless you have decent enough aim that you can hit enemies as you jump around and approach and reposition yourself, because if you don't have great aim, then stopping to shoot an enemy before you go into melee is actually going to be a DPS loss, and you should just be going in and meleeing them instead. And another thing to note about the Unending Battle is that the perk currently doesn't apply at point blank like the description says. It applies when you are shooting an enemy like 5 to 15 feet away from them, I would say. If they ever do change the perk so that it activates at point blank range, then I would say that it can benefit the melee playstyle a lot more, because you can be meleeing an enemy, say that you're behind a Scar Enforcer and you're just wailing on them, and you can just pull out the gun, shoot real quick, and then go back to meleeing for 5 seconds. Now, Unending Battle could become a lot more viable, but we'll have to see if BioWare does that. The next category that I want to talk about is assault rifles. There's only 2 assault rifles that I consider recommending. That's going to be Divine Vengeance and Rauner's Blaze. Now, Divine Vengeance I've really just included for people who like burst weapons. I really don't think that it's on par with Rauner's Blaze, because the perk does require you to hit weak points in order to cause those fire explosions, and a lot of the time it's going to be hard to land the burst on an enemy that's in a group. It just doesn't have the all-around usefulness of Rauner's Blaze, which I want to get to now. Rauner's Blaze, something to know about this is it doesn't just apply a fire debuff after hitting the enemy 5 times. There's a little bit of a hidden mechanic they don't tell you in the description, which is that when it ignites the target, it will actually proc and do a large amount of fire damage. This makes it decent for taking out shields, as well as putting the fire debuff on any enemy, which increases your DPS. And this fire damage proc can happen repeatedly, so every 5 shots you'll be hitting them for a good chunk of fire damage. Now, fire damage will not work against fire-based enemies unless you lower their resistances with Target Beacon. Another thing about the Rauner's Blaze that's kind of cool is you can kill Scar Enforcers through their shield. So the last weapon category that I want to talk about is marksman rifles, and the only marksman rifle I think is worth bringing up is the Thunderbolt of Ivenia. One thing to note about this, just like with the Rauner's Blaze, it does not work against electricity-based enemies. It'll do 0 damage to them unless you lower their resistances with Target Beacon. And another thing that I think is kind of a downside of Thunderbolt of Ivenia is, despite the fact that it's great at taking out shields, there are a lot of situations where the shield is going to be the first thing to go, so it's hard to actually get a chance to utilize that electricity damage to take out the shields of the enemies. An example of this is against Scar. If you're running Temple of Scar, most enemies are going to be armored except for the Scar Scouts and the Scar Hunters. So while you can take out their shields with the Thunderbolt of Ivenia, a lot of the time you could have just moved in and meleeed them down anyways. Thunderbolt is a little bit more specialized, and if you know you're going to be fighting a lot of shielded enemies, it can definitely be good. However, the fire debuff from Rauner's Blaze is going to be useful more often because you can use it against anything, and you can use it against a boss to, say, get that fire debuff on them as you're jumping in to increase DPS, or maybe you just put the debuff before you switch to your other weapon. And another little fun thing about the Rauner's Blaze is that it can thaw enemies, so if you happen to freeze an enemy in the air, you can use the ice proc, or the fire proc rather, to melt them and make them drop to the ground. Personally, if I had to pick between the two, I would pick Rauner's Blaze. It's a little bit more predictable, it's useful in a wide variety of situations, and being a melee interceptor is so specialized in that you're amazing at single target and sometimes good at AoE, depending on which abilities that you bring. It can be nice to have a good all-around weapon. Now, I like my primary being a good all-around weapon in general, or suited to the melee playstyle, because it means that my secondary can be a boss killer / elite burner. And this for me is always going to be a Glorious Result or a Truth of Tarsus. Right now, I run the Glorious Result because I got great rolls on it. If I had a better Truth of Tarsus, I might consider switching to that. The reason I always want my secondary to be a boss / elite killer weapon is because that's generally the one thing that the melee interceptor isn't good at, and so this kind of fills that hole. And so you want to bring a weapon that's good against luminaries, titans, Scar Enforcers, enemies that you can't always go in and melee the whole time. Lastly, to end the weapon portion of the video, I just want to say that these are the guns that I recommend the most with a melee build, but it's important to remember that in Anthem, we have to play the hand that we're dealt. You could easily get inscriptions on a gun that make it insane, but I've recommended these mainly because they fill some type of gap that the melee playstyle can use. Alright, so now we're going to talk about abilities, and I'm first going to go into strike systems because I want to talk a little bit about Tempest Strike and Detonating Strike, and a tip that I have for those abilities that is going to also be alluded to when I talk about Spark Dash later. Alright, so first up, we're going to talk about Tempest Strike. Now, Tempest Strike does decent AoE damage, and its damage is physical and fire. This means that it'll work well against armor, and that explosion can be useful if enemies are really tightly together, although it's been hard for me to test if that actually does hit enemies multiple times. Last thing about Tempest Strike is it can be used to knock Scar Hunters out of the air, which is really useful because then you can get them on the ground and of course melee them. And now I want to teach you guys a really great tip for the Tempest Strike. It can actually negate the stagger from enemy melees, essentially parrying their attack, but you still take the damage. This works versus Enforcers, Brutes, and other enemies as well. I haven't been able to test it against every single enemy. And the reason that Tempest Strike and Detonating Strike are the best for doing this is because they actually interrupt your melee attack sequence, which means that whenever the enemy melees you, you can use one of these abilities, interrupt your attack sequence, and negate the stagger from their attack. And again, that does work with Detonating Strike as well. Detonating Strike is great because it does electric damage, so it is good versus shields, and it's great for clearing out trash as well, which Tempest Strike isn't that great at. And it's especially useful when there are a lot of elites nearby one another, because that means you can hit all of them. It does not knock Scar Hunters out of the air, which is kind of sad because I really like using Detonating Strike. Another great tip for Detonating Strike in particular is it does work against entities that kill themselves. So It's gonna work with Scorpion Workers, Scar Seeker Mines, Static Scar Mines, and barrels. So this tip can be used to increase your efficiency a little bit by using your detonating strike intelligently. One thing about detonating strike is that it isn't as good at single target damage as Tempest Strike. I totally agree with this, but it's important to remember that you can use it for single target if you plan ahead. If you want to, say, use it on a weak enemy near an elite that you're planning on attacking, then you can put it on a trash mob, detonate it, and it'll do some damage to the elite, maybe take out their shield. And if you do it in the middle of a bunch of elites, this can actually help your team out because it clears out nearby trash and destroys the shields of all the elites in the area. And it's definitely more efficient at doing those things than Tempest Strike could ever be under equal inscriptions. Another example of how you can use detonating strike better, you'll notice at some point in this video I leave an enemy alive in the center, and the reason I do this is because I'm saving it for later so that I can detonate it when more enemies have spawned in. This is kind of situational, but it's a good little tip and I wanted to toss it in there. The third ability that I think is worth talking about when it comes to a melee build is Venom Spray. Now, Venom Spray does decent damage, and it can do good damage if you get a good roll. However, without a great damage roll, your Venom Spray probably won't scale too well into GM2 and GM3. And another thing that a lot of people don't know about this ability is it has a lower priming rate. You can see the priming rate is 15 here compared to Venom Bomb, which is 60. Now, this is actually intentional by BioWare. They want the ability to prime slower, but I think that it could use some tweaking. I've tested this myself, and it does prime enemies after a few seconds, but it doesn't ever prime elites and legendaries, depending on their resistances. I haven't been able to try this against every enemy, but in general, it's just hard to think of it as a primer right now because it's hardly ever going to prime by time you can actually really make use of it. I guess unless you're on GM3 using it on some trash moms, but that's way too situational. Combined with the perk you get from Mauler's Venom, which is the Masterwork Venom Bomb buff, and some components that boost your strike system damage, you can get your Venom Spray to a really good place, but I would advise against this because you're just committing too much to your Venom Spray and of course sacrificing melee damage and survivability. I'm going to play a little clip here that demonstrates the value of Venom Spray when it comes to building an ult, because that's really the main reason you would take this ability over Tempest Strike or Detonating Strike. In the video, you'll see me gain about 75% of my ult with a total of 8 hits on the digesters and 4 enemy deaths. Now I want to note that since Venom Spray is really meant for an ult building build or an ultimate cycling build, you should definitely take the new Masterwork Ultimate Component Emergency Power. If you use this along with Venom Spray, you can get a lot of ultimates. I have personally tested the ultimate cycling build on GM1 Tyrant Mine, and I am consistently able to get between 17 and 20 ultimates off through, let's just say, a 13-minute run. I could easily see you breaking 20, and if you're on GM2, I could see you breaking 30 pretty easily as well if you really work at it. On GM2, the Tyrant Mine boss, I was able to get 6 ults off alone, and I wasn't even trying to. So that does it for strike systems, and I'm going to move on to assault systems. Now, when it comes to assault systems, we're really talking about Spark Dash, Venom Bomb, and Cryoglaive. I'm going to go over Cryoglaive and Spark Dash first because Venom Bomb is really easy to talk about. So Spark Dash can negate staggers in the same way that Tempest Strike and Detonating Strike can, but it's important to know that it cannot interrupt your melee attack sequence, which means it's rather difficult to time your Spark Dash with the enemy melees. So it's really not great for this, but if you want to use it, I just wanted to include that so that you can go ahead and give it a try. Beyond that, the reason we use Spark Dash is for mobility and electricity damage. Now, its base damage isn't that great, but if you get at least, say, a 100% damage roll on your Spark Dash, I could see it scaling decently into GM2, but not GM3. And if you don't have great damage for your Spark Dash, at that point you're really just using it for your mobility over the other abilities that are in this assault system. The ability does give you that great mobility, but it has some shortcomings that should be noted. It can make the camera go a little wonky, it can lock on to the wrong target, and it does lock you in place for a second, so there are a lot of situations where it would be a bad decision to use it, and you could have just as easily dashed, jumped, or melee jumped your way out of it. And if you have teammates who you know are bringing acid and ice primers, then Spark Dash does become more viable, because that means you don't need to bring those things, and you can have that mobility / detonator and still have acid and ice to help you do more damage to the enemies and put out more DPS. Just to give you an idea of how the Spark Dash stacks up versus regular Interceptor mobility, I'll show you a little comparison of me charging a turret on flat ground versus me just jumping towards it, and you can see how much longer it takes me to get there just by jumping. The speed difference is not huge, which means that the mobility of Spark Dash really isn't that great on flat ground. However, if there is some verticality to how you're moving, a target that's below you or a target that's above you, then Spark Dash can save you a good amount of time. So now we're going to talk about Cryoglaive. Cryoglaive, just like Venom Bomb, is a primer, so it's good for comboing, and combos are great single target damage, and the aura is always nice, especially with Cryoglaive, because that ice aura allows you to heal everything near you, and you can keep some targets frozen for the entire duration of your aura, which is really nice because this means that someone else doesn't have to do it. If you think about just keeping an enemy frozen but from your aura, as opposed to having, say, a storm continuously freeze that target, the ice aura allows you to keep that target frozen while you and the storm both just get to keep DPSing it, meaning that neither of you has to stop and refreeze the target, making it so that you can both do more overall DPS. Now, the perk that the Cryoglaive has, hitting an enemy from above detonates an ice explosion, really isn't that great. But if you plan on throwing your Cryoglaive at a target and you happen to be above them, then you can definitely at least keep this perk in mind, because the ice explosion is decent damage. I think mine does about 14,000 right now. The Cryoglaive freeze works especially well versus targets like the Enforcer or turrets or brutes, because they can hit hard and stagger you a lot, and instead of having to deal with that or worry about it and dodge around, you can instead just wail on them and do more overall DPS. Now, it's also important to know that the freeze effect from your Cryoglaive / Ice Aura does stop some attacks from staggering you. I haven't been able to test this completely, but I do know that sometimes when I'm fighting a legendary Enforcer and I freeze them, some of their melees won't stagger me for some reason. I've ran through Temple of Scar a whole bunch of times, and I've had this happen a lot. So I'm not sure if it's reducing the force from their attacks or if it's a bug or what. But I've used it on legendary Enforcers in Temple of Scar, and I noticed that their melee attacks don't stagger me all the time. However, the shield bash attack they have always staggers me. So I'm not really sure when that can be used or when that happens, but it's just something I wanted to throw in there because it's a great tip, and when I am fighting those legendary Enforcers, I use it and it helps me do more DPS. So the last assault system that we got to talk about is, of course, Venom Bomb. Venom Bomb provides an acid debuff to all the enemies affected, so your team does increased damage, and it's a primer for comboing. As I said with Cryoglaive, combos are great single target damage, and the aura is also a nice addition to your single target DPS and kind of helps out with killing weak enemies near you, but not really. When it comes to Venom Bomb, one thing that not all players know is it has a persistent cloud that lasts a few seconds. I think it's like 6. And you can actually use it preemptively on enemies that are shielded, allowing you to take out their shield and then prime them right after the shield gets dropped without you ever having to stop meleeing. Now, if you do run Venom Bomb, which is the ability that I run in my assault system most of the time, it's important to understand how they pair up with the different abilities. If you use Venom Bomb with Tempest Strike, it's pretty simple. You want to put the Venom Bomb on whatever you're going to be Tempest Striking. If you're gonna Venom Bomb with Detonating Strike, you can use it on the target that you're going to detonate so that you can kill them faster, or you can use the Venom Bomb on the target that you're going to get the acid debuff on them and then go detonate another target and do extra damage to the real main target you're going for. To make this even sweeter, you can toss the target beacon on the target that you want the detonation to hit hardest. If you're running Venom Bomb with Venom Spray, then you obviously want to use Venom Bomb on the same targets that you're going to Venom Spray because of what I talked about with the priming rate. It's not really going to prime most of the time when you want it to, and it's also just nice because you just want to do more acid damage to all of those mobs. However, in all of these situations, if you have a Venom Bomb that has 2 or 3 charges, then sometimes it can help to toss the Venom Bomb to wherever your team is fighting as well, just to help them do more damage. Or if there's a pack of elites that spawns in, you can get the acid on all of them and then just go do your thing and attack whoever you want to. Now we're going to quickly go over the 2 support systems that the Interceptor has. First one is Target Beacon. Now this reduces targets' resistance, so enemies like the Frost Brute, who have 100% frost resist, can actually be frozen in some cases if you use the target beacon on them. Normally, frost damage will be completely ineffective against these frost-based enemies. And sometimes I've had it so that the enemy actually can be primed with that element. But I think that depends on the priming rate of the ability. And of course, target beacon is also great because it helps you and your team do more damage. When it comes to Rally Cry, sometimes I do actually like this as a melee interceptor because you can use it to save yourself from fire if you're trying to avoid the flamethrower of an enforcer or if you get hit by a titan wave. And fire is of course one of the most dangerous debuffs in the game, especially for a melee interceptor, so it's really useful to have this, but it's really hard to make an argument for it being better than Target Beacon. It has a long cooldown, and compared to the high uptime and overall usability of Target Beacon, it just doesn't seem worth it to take most of the time, and it also doesn't help the team. Because of its short range and long cooldown, it's going to be hard to be in position and have it up. So that does it for the ability portion of the video. I am going to make another video in the future where I go in depth into all 10 of the Interceptor's abilities, and I might go in a little bit more depth into the support systems if I feel like there's any reason to, but definitely look out for that if you want to know more about all of the Interceptor abilities. Now we're going to go over components. First thing I do want to say before we talk about components is all of the talk I hear about melee interceptor builds, everyone always says just stack armor, don't get shields. And I think that this is a little silly because while having more armor is great, I don't necessarily think that not having a good shield is good. The reason people say that you should bring armor is pretty much this. Way of the Bold lets you get 20% health back whenever you defeat someone with melee. There's also this other component that benefits from having armor stacking where you get a damage boost every time you pick up a repair pack. So if you use this component, Symbiotic Surge, obviously you could benefit really well from having a weak shield because that means your health gets taken out sooner and therefore you pick up repair packs. But I really don't like the whole idea of this playstyle just because it kind of assumes that you're going to be defeating enemies and picking up repair packs all the time, which implies that you're killing weak enemies, and really I don't think that that is what you should be doing as an interceptor, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more when I talk about the Scar Scout tips in a little bit. But that's just my piece on the whole armor versus shields debate. Having high armor does make sense if you run these two components. I could see that working, but I don't like that you would be killing trash mobs a lot of the time to benefit from these two components to the maximum. And having a high shield definitely isn't a bad thing if you aren't running Symbiotic Surge. I personally have really high shield, and I think that it works really well as giving me that buffer before my softened blows kicks in. So let's go over all the components now, and I'm going to talk about the bottom 4 here because I consider these to be essential. Now, Way of the Bold is pretty much giving you lifesteal like I just talked about while blowing through weaker enemies, and it also gives you an additional way to keep being effective by killing enemies and heal up whenever you're taking out or in between taking out elites. Now you're always going to try to have an aura up no matter what because it helps your DPS if the option is there for you. So having that extra aura damage is a nice little plus. One tip I have for Way of the Bold is sometimes when I'm focusing down elites and legendaries, I'll intentionally keep trash mobs alive so that whenever I get chunked by them, I can just go and kill some trash mobs that I had saved, and they get right back to killing the important enemies instead of having to run for cover or seek out a health pack. And if you're running Radiant Fortress, this can be especially good because you can jump away from your targets, get some shield back, go kill some weak mobs, heal up, and as you're jumping back in, tag them with Radiant Fortress again, and now you've got full armor and shields all within 5 seconds, and you're back fighting the enemies fully healed, fully shielded. The next component is Vengeance Matrix. This one, it's pretty obvious why you should take this. Plus 50% damage. I pretty much bring this on every single Interceptor build because that 25% damage taken is just, it's always worth paying that price. For a melee build, no matter what, you should always bring Conductive Lettuce. A couple of things that I want to say about this. The electricity explosion is a huge overall DPS increase, and it helps you take out shields. And the gear cooldown speed is always good because abilities are going to shape how your melee build plays and what it is capable of, and being capable of those things more often could only be helpful. Last thing I want to say about Conductive Lettuce is it does not apply its damage when you are using your ultimate. And so next up we have Way of Resolve. Now this is pretty much a given why you would bring this. It's increased melee damage, already dash around all the time by default, so you're always going to have the buff. You want to make sure that you keep this up when you are fighting a target that is, for example, frozen, or even if it's just an elite that is focusing on another teammate of yours and you're just wailing on it. You always want to make sure to just dash out and then dive right back in so you can keep that 40% damage buff and not lose a lot of time on your melees. Now these next two components up here at the top I do consider to be optional, and you can swap them out for a lot of stuff. Now I usually run Softened Blows if I'm on GM2 or GM3. The reason being that having that bigger shield buffer is nice, and having the damage resistance of 75% when my shield breaks gives me a little bit more of a buffer to figure out, do I want to stay in and keep hitting these guys? Am I going to need to worry? And it gives me time to evaluate who's shooting at me, what I might need to worry about getting hit by, do I have cover nearby, all things like that. It's just nice to have that 5 seconds where you can continue DPSing without getting totally nuked, and also giving you a chance to think about what you want to do if you do think that you have to worry and run away. Now, the top component, Way of Integration here, I think that this could be multiple things. You could use Emergency Power, you could use Symbiotic Surge, and you could use Way of the Swift. Now, again, any of these could be swapped out for the top two components. I just like running Softened Blows because I like to make sure that I don't go down when I'm fighting these tough enemies, even though I could have another component that gives me plus 30% damage or something like that. Way of the Swift is nice, but doesn't necessarily work well in every build or with every Q ability. For example, if you have a Cryoglaive with one charge, it's not going to be useful because you won't be able to use your Q often enough that your E will benefit from it often, or left bumper, right bumper if you're on console. Way of Integration can be good, but it's not going to be useful with every ability pairing, just like with Way of the Swift. Venom Bomb is really good for getting the 2 gear hit streaks, and one thing you should know about this is it doesn't mean ticks from your Venom Bomb. So if your Venom Bomb is affecting a target and it ticks twice, this will not give you the 30% buff for 5 seconds. You have to either hit 2 targets with your Venom Bomb throw, or if you have 2 charges, you can throw 1 charge at one enemy and the second charge at another, and that will give you the 30% damage buff. Now, Way of Integration is kind of in between in that it's really only going to be good if you can get those gear hit streaks, but it's only a 5-second buff, so it doesn't last long no matter what. However, if you are running a Venom Bomb Venom Spray build, I would say that this component is definitely a must. If we're talking about Emergency Power, this is good because it means that you don't need to save your ultimate anymore. You'll always have your save your life button with your ultimate anytime that you need it, because as an interceptor, you can be running and jumping away and dodging through the air very easily as you get knocked to 1 HP, and then you just pop your ultimate and you're good. The only downside of this is that if you do get nuked to death because you let yourself get staggered, it won't be able to save you in time in some situations. Lastly, I just want to touch on Symbiotic Surge again. This is good because it gives more armor, and good if you like to kill a lot of trash mobs, which again I don't think you should be doing. Downside of that is of course that this damage boost will almost never be up when you are fighting the beefiest targets at GM2 and GM3 unless you intentionally go out of your way to make sure you pick up a repair pack and that you don't have health or you don't have full health so that you can pick up that repair pack and then go to the beefier targets, which personally I don't like doing that, although I could see it working really well if you have really high repair pack drop rates. And again, that's just another example of how in Anthem sometimes the inscriptions that we get dictate what kind of play styles actually work well with the gear that we have. Now I'm going to share some general interceptor tips, and then we'll end the video with sigils and some gameplay clips. One thing you should know with a melee interceptor build is how to interrupt your melee attack sequence. One of the worst things you can do in terms of efficiency is kill a target and let your melee animation finish, making it so that you're just standing there attacking nothing. You can interrupt your melee attacks with either a dash or a jump. And I'll include a little example here, but you will also be able to see me doing this in actual gameplay when I show you the gameplay clips at the end. Another tip that I want to talk about with the Interceptor is how to use your ultimate a little bit better. One thing you should know, and this is probably obvious to most of you, but you cannot fly and you cannot melee jump. You can, of course, triple dash and triple jump during your ultimate, but that's not the real tip I want to go over. The real thing I want to talk about with the ultimate is using the after images correctly. Now, when you use your ultimate as Interceptor and you attack a target, when you land the third hit in the first attack sequence, it will leave after images attacking that target for a while. And you can use this to spread your damage over multiple targets. You can actually attack one elite, attack another, attack a third, a fourth, a fifth, having your after images attack all of these targets, doing essentially AoE damage. Obviously, these after images supplement your main damage so you can do great single target with your ultimate. But you hardly see interceptors using the after images to spread their damage really well so that they can take out a bunch of elites in one ultimate instead of just focusing on a couple and just continuously meleeing them as the after images apply. I also want to talk about Scar Scouts, because you should always be killing Scar Scouts for your team as the Interceptor. With the insane mobility that you have, you are one of the best for it, and you're also great at single target. But there's a couple of little things that you should know that can help you be better at killing Scar Scouts. The first tip is you can fly, jump, and dodge near them to bait them into meleeing, because it has a cooldown of about 5-6 seconds, and when they are not able to melee, of course you can just kill them. Second tip I want to give is you should position yourself so that if they do melee you, it won't knock you off of wherever the sniper is perched. Getting staggered is always bad, but it's 5 times worse if you get knocked off of something like in this clip here. Sometimes you can start meleeing them and staggering them, especially if you catch them mid-shot before they're able to try and melee you, and of course in that situation you can just kill them. The last and most important tip that I have for dealing with Scar Scouts is that whenever possible, you should engage them with an aerial attack like this. Even though those other tips are great and can help you in some situations, anytime it's possible, you should engage them with an aerial attack. And now we're briefly going to go over sigils. First one I want to talk about is the lightning sigil. Of course, you should bring this anytime you use detonating strike and maybe spark dash, but I would pretty much almost always bring it because the lightning damage will improve your conductive lettuce, which means that your melees are just going to do way more damage because the lightning proc will be improved. I would also say you should almost always bring the melee sigil. It does improve the damage of your detonating and Tempest Strike as well as your regular melees, despite what it says about only increasing the damage of your melee abilities. And when it comes to the third sigil, I think that you should use either a combo sigil, which is great for single target damage because the combo reactions will again hit for a lot of single target damage. Gear cooldown speed, because it just lets you use your abilities more. The reason to bring that is pretty obvious. And if you have an ultimate cycling build, gear cooldown speed is especially useful because you can get more venom sprays off. And if you're running venom bomb, venom spray, or maybe even just venom spray, you might consider taking an acid sigil. If you are running an ultimate cycling build, could bring an ultimate sigil, but I don't necessarily know if this is the best idea or not. I haven't had a chance to test this because I hardly ever run the ultimate cycling build. It does say that it's 30% of base damage, which means that it might not be that great, but if it does work off of the actual damage that you do now before the sigil, then I could see that being really good. Alright guys, now I'm going to let some gameplay clips play while I say some things. Really, this guide just kind of goes over the overall best suggestions for builds that do at least some things really well and most things pretty well. But it really comes down to knowing the difference between the builds and what they specialize in, and whether or not those situations are going to come up often enough in what you are going to be doing to justify bringing that build. Depending on what your team needs, you could run a build that's better at clearing trash, or maybe it's specialized towards single target damage and mobility, and all you do is run around killing elites for your team. It really just depends on what you think is needed, and it's also about understanding how your character fits in your team, even in a pug, and how you can play off of what your teammates have brought. If you guys know of any exceptions to something I said, if you have any tips on melee builds that I didn't mention, or something like that, please let me know in the comments. I love learning everything I can and talking strategy with people. I hope that you guys enjoyed all the tips that I have for how to play and build a melee interceptor better. Remember to like and subscribe to the video, and let me know in the comments what you would like to see next. Make sure to share this video with all your fellow interceptors. I want to put out really high quality content that has advanced tips and tricks that you won't see anywhere else. And really the only way for me to know if you guys actually want that is if you guys let me know somehow. So please remember to do that. If you want to discuss anything at all that was said here, my stream is the best place to talk to me. You can find the link below. And if you ever just want to come by and say thanks, I'd appreciate that too. You guys have a good one.